Good morning, everybody. Hey, thanks so much for taking the time to be here. It is a real privilege to be back in Singapore. I had the opportunity to live here for some period of time in 2013 and was so incredibly impressed during that period of what it feels like to have a nation, a city-state that has security for its citizens, that feels secure, the innovation that that can produce, the freedom that it can produce. So I think that was a very pivotal time in my career, although I'd been in the security space for a very long time. And it gave me a different view on how security needs to look going forward. And I would love to just share with you some thoughts about one of the most treasured concepts inside of information security, defense in depth, that you heard a little bit about earlier this morning, and how defense in depth as a concept is evolving in modern times. So I want to talk about some of the factors that are changing that are augmenting our view of what defense in depth means in a world of cloud services, in a world where defenders have access to great analytics, in a world where adversaries have access to great analytics. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of defense in depth. I am a recovering professor, so I taught for many years at Columbia University. And if you ever teach a course on computer security, you have to talk about defense in depth. And it is mandatory, I don't know why, but it's mandatory to show a picture of a castle, because it's always talked about in terms of a castle. There is a castle, and it has a moat, and then it has these big walls, and then it has guard towers and archer towers, and this is a model of what defense in depth is. And it is very true that there are some principles in there that we can learn from. So I want to start out, before I get into some of the changes that have happened to impact our view of defense in depth for technology, just by sharing with you a personal security story. So I mentioned, I lived in Singapore for a while in 2013. I moved here with my wife and two small children. I travel all the time. Probably that year spent 500,000 miles on an airplane, which I don't encourage. If you ever tried that, if you've never tried that, don't do that. It's not very good, a denial of life attack. And so by the end of this stay in Singapore, my wife came up to me one day and said, look, we're moving back in December to the US, which we'd planned to do. And before that, we are taking a vacation, non-negotiable, and I am picking the location for the vacation. And I'm like, that seems perfectly reasonable. Go ahead, wherever you want. And so she came back and picked Bali in Indonesia. How many people have been to Bali? I would think quite a few. Short trip from here. And I'd not been there before, so of course I looked for the comprehensive kind of guide to Bali, which of course is Wikipedia, which is a comprehensive guide to everything. And something in there was incredibly intriguing to me, and it was the monkey forest in Bali. How many people have been to that forest? Very, very interesting. So let me just tell you that I was so excited about going there. And I had a very, I'd say, romanticized view of what going there meant. So my children watched a television show called Curious George. I don't know if anybody's seen that, but it's a cartoon about a very likable, affable monkey, and does mischievous things every once in a while. So this was my view of wild monkeys, right? This is what a monkey is, very kind of cute, and I had all these views of hugging a monkey, taking a picture together with a monkey, and so I was very excited when I got there. And so we showed up at this monkey forest, and this is the first thing that you see. right? A very imposing, almost ominous set of statues, a couple of warnings, and I'm like, this is just for the tourists, it's just there for really kind of effect. And so then we walked into the entrance to this monkey forest, and we ran into a banana seller immediately. And so, very excited. I bought a bushel of bananas for myself. I bought a bushel for my wife, and my brother-in-law had also come to join us. I bought a bushel of bananas for him. And we walked in probably 15 seconds after we got into this forest, and we run into 4 very large monkeys. And I'm like, this is great. This is exactly what I'd hoped for, unbelievable. It felt like we were in National Geographic. And so I broke off a banana from the bushel, threw it to one of the monkeys. The monkey peeled it and ate it. I'm like, oh man, this is incredible. My brother-in-law did the same thing, throws it to another monkey. The monkey eats it. But for some reason, and this is still a point of contention today with my wife, even many years later, she would not give any of those monkeys a banana. I still don't know why. So, and you could see the tension starting to build between her and these monkeys. So they were looking at her, looking at the bananas, looking at each other, looking at her, looking at the bananas. She was completely unfazed by this. And then maybe 10 seconds later, they attack. Now, if you've never been attacked by a group of large monkeys, it's a very memorable experience. I wouldn't recommend it, but it is quite memorable. So, as the monkeys started to attack, my wife weaponizes her bananas, right? So she starts peeling them off, throwing them at the monkeys while kind of coming back, and finally throws the whole bushel. They descend on it, and then we run away. And unfortunately, we ran deeper into the monkey forest because we were a little disoriented. And so I want to share with you a family vacation photo. This is shortly after that attack. That's me, obviously, on the left. That's my brother-in-law on the right. My wife is taking the photo, so she's not in the picture. And I want to draw your attention to the area just above the waistline on both of us. And you may notice that in there are the remaining bananas that we salvaged from our bushels. And we figured if we put them in our shirts and rolled it up, that the monkeys would never see them. They wouldn't think that we had them, and that we would be pretty safe. I'd also like to draw your attention to that medium-sized monkey on the right of the photo. So about maybe 15 seconds after this photo was taken, that medium-sized monkey, which looks fairly nice and kind of congenial, summoned over 14 or 15 of his friends. Those guys ripped my shirt, ripped my brother-in-law's shirt, took the bananas. I also had a pack of crackers in my pocket. Somehow they knew that. They took that too. And now we had absolutely nothing of interest to a monkey, and obviously ran away, but unfortunately, again, ran deeper into this monkey forest. And as many of you know that have visited it, right at the back of this forest is a beautiful temple. And at that temple are these very, very small monkeys. So these are monkeys that wouldn't have survived in those 2 initial waves, right? They weren't big enough to be able to wrestle a banana out of the kind of like confused tourist. So we saw these things just kind of hanging out on a wall, and my wife had somewhat kind of recovered from her initial monkey encounter. And so we decided to approach these seemingly harmless, very small monkeys. And we notice that, they're kind of, making little gestures, dancing, kind of drawing us in. And so my wife leans over to look at one, and within seconds, the monkey was on her head and had taken off this thing that was holding her hair together. I think it's called a scrunchie. and had gone back to the wall and was now dancing and waving it around, right? So, not quite sure what was happening, and I looked down the wall, and there was another small monkey that had a guy's glasses in its hand and was also kind of dancing around with these glasses. And so, very confused by all of this, we then were approached from behind by a banana seller that explains to us that these are the extortionist group of monkeys. Right? They were too small to kind of make it in those first waves, so they've had to become more creative and adaptive over time. And what he told us, which is pretty remarkable, is that they will actually negotiate with you for the return of your items, and their currency is, not surprisingly, bananas, and conveniently he had bananas that he could sell us for a price. So we did that, and I think the scrunchie was like a 3-banana transaction. We tried one, the monkey says no, waves us off, and then we got to 3, and he thinks it's a reasonable deal, so we got the scrunchie back. The guy with the glasses was like a 12-banana transaction, very expensive. But I found this absolutely fascinating, and so then we sat on another wall and just watched this happen over and over and over again to people for probably another hour. And it was pretty incredible because they seemed to know who to go after. They seemed to know who would cave and ultimately pay the ransom or pay the extortion, and they would go after those people. Really, really fascinating. Now, some might call that instinct, right? Others may call it analytics. It's data that has been analyzed over a large set of people that have come through that forest over and over and over again, and somehow they've found indicators. Maybe it's the way that somebody walks, or maybe it's how they hold themselves or how they talk to somebody else, but they have found indicators that realize that there is susceptibility in this person. Now, to me, that is a powerful example of analytics in a very, very visceral, very kind of nature sort of way. Today, we talk about analytics all the time in the security space, but what does it actually mean? Like, what can we do if we are better at analytics, and is there some preview of it that exists in other fields that may be more mature than we are, that have been using these machine learning and AI techniques for a lot longer on different problems? And it turns out there are many of these fields. I wanted to share one interesting example with you. It's a game and a website called fold.it. If you've never been there before, actually, I strongly encourage you not to go there. Right? It is a denial of weekend attack waiting to happen. Right? It's like the first time you played Tetris, and then 12 hours passes and you don't know what happened to them. It's a very, very addictive game, and the idea behind it is you're taking these molecules and you're folding proteins. It's a protein folding game, but it's very, very addictive. It has very simple but very set rules. And it turns out when you look into how the game was constructed, the rules of the game are created to exactly mimic the rules of nature and biology. So as all of these folks, tens of thousands of people, are playing this game, applying creativity, investing their time in it, they're actually solving very, very difficult problems, or at least pieces of very difficult problems in medical science. And if you look at the results of what's happened, it's incredible to see the publications that have come from those medical doctors and biological researchers that set up that site, take these incremental innovations that have been created by people who've been playing the game and aggregating them and making true breakthroughs in their field. I think that this is a really interesting other application of analytics. It's having a large group of folks applying their intellect, their intelligence, their drive, their motivation to a problem, and then us aggregating that and learning from it. So I bring this up to set the scene on defense in depth because we are definitely in the era today, or the epoch of security, that is focused around analytics. Defenders are focused on analytics, attackers are focused on analytics, defenders are focused on machine learning and those kinds of techniques. We're seeing more attackers, sophisticated attackers, focus on adversarial machine learning that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So that's one important change that's happened. Another change that is very, very impactful to how we defend is just a change in the way that we consume technology. You know, if you think about an enterprise, standard enterprise, you know, you pick the vertical 10 years ago, the architecture looked like some more complex version of this. There were some key headquarter data centers, and then there were some key headquarter offices, and then there were some branch offices, and then there was a security stack that sat in between the employees that worked at those offices and the internet, right? And all the things that you would expect went into that security stack: firewalls, web gateways, intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, DLP, and that's how we defend it. And then for the branch office, we would have that thing essentially create an MPLS connection back to those main data centers, and that's where they would break off to the internet, or some very small set of them. Now back then, you could take the classical properties of defense in depth and apply them in a reasonable way. And I would argue that these are invariant properties of defense in depth. They were true 1,000 years ago when you were building a castle. They really are going to be true 1,000 years from now. And let me just talk about them briefly. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. The first is that there's this concept that you should have multiple layers of defense, right? It's the moat, plus the gate, plus the high wall, plus the archers. The second is that you should have consistency of application. So you have to have those things around the whole castle, not just around the front of the castle, or else somebody's just going to walk around the back of the castle. So that's the second important concept. The third concept is that there must be diversity in those layers, meaning that you can't just put up 3 moats. And the reason is, if you get somebody very good at swimming and getting past dragons and things like that, then they can just apply those skills 3 times to get into the castle. But if you have different kinds of defenses, they have to apply different sets of skills, which will delay them and give you better opportunities to defend. So these are classic, what I think are invariant, will exist for all time, properties of defense in depth. So now let's talk about what has changed in architecture, and then let's talk about how those properties are going to get augmented, I think, today. So one of the biggest changes that's happened is the user left the building, and that happened quite a while ago now. The user is getting more work done typically outside of an office environment than they do inside of an office environment. And they're directly connecting, in many cases, on personal devices to resources that are on the internet. A second thing that happened is that a lot of the application logic, a lot of the business logic, a lot of the workflows have moved out to cloud resources. And it's because of the great success of companies like Salesforce and Office 365 and others. What also happened is even proprietary applications that we have built, some of them have also moved off to the cloud thanks to innovation from companies like Amazon and Google and Microsoft and Alibaba. We're seeing many of those workloads move outside. We're also seeing almost all of the traffic that is going to those resources pushing through the internet, the web channel, and they're pushing through port 443. So they're going encrypted. Now, this is an important change because if you went back 5 years ago, maybe 15% of the traffic that was leaving an enterprise was encrypted. Today, it's somewhere on the order of 80%. This is an important factor to consider because that security stack that you had in the center is not going to work if it's operating on encrypted traffic. If you don't have a mechanism to look inside that encrypted traffic, it's not going to do what it originally did, and you get erosion. The second thing that's happening is that the regional office, now understanding that most of the resources they care about are in the cloud and not back at the data center at home, they are foregoing those expensive MPLS connections, and they're breaking out directly to the internet, especially for multinationals, which makes sense because that's where the resources are that they care about. And finally, we are seeing a diversity of endpoints, including IoT devices, that are also reaching out directly to those cloud resources, either for personal purposes or for business purposes, and the line between those two things is getting completely blurred. So this generally is today's reality. So how does defense in depth get augmented in this kind of environment? Well, first, I think that there's a set of additive requirements that we have on defense in depth from a security perspective. First is we have to have an architecture that is pluggable. Think about how much has changed just in the last 5 years. We've seen a massive botnet get formed from IoT devices that has been harnessed to launch a very, very significant attack. We have seen attacks that are so sophisticated, not technically, but socially, that they're really challenging our view of what a nation state can do. We're seeing all of these things happen and evolve very, very quickly, which means that we need the ability over time to plug into our defense in depth layers new innovation that can come from a whole bunch of different places. It could come from a math student at MIT. It could come from a startup. It could come from a big security company. But wherever it comes from, we have to have an architecture that is adaptable enough that it can consume that new innovation and apply it very quickly. A great example of this, I think, is the iPhone. Now, I call the iPhone now the same properties hold for Android and phones that use the Android operating system. Those things are highly adaptable systems. If you think about what they are really, they're just a giant sensor, right? They have microphones, they have cameras, they have gyroscopes, they have GPS, they have the ability to sense a whole bunch of things and then display things. But then the majority of the innovation that happens on those platforms happens from third parties that are individuals or companies that build applications. And at least for me, I never know what my iPhone is going to have to become today, right? Like a lot of times it's a GPS system for me. I don't know where I am and I need to go somewhere. But one time, and I'll tell you a story very quickly, I'm also the program chairman of RSA Conference, have been for almost 10 years now. And so during RSA Conference weeks, very stressful week. I mean, it's a great conference, really encourage you to go there. But during the week of the conference, quite a few things kind of happen, strange things that you have to deal with. And so I remember 2 years ago, it was a Wednesday morning, some odd things that happened the day before, and I woke up with this crazy nosebleed. I'd never had a nosebleed before in my life. And so this iPhone, you know, first thing, my first instinct was, how can I contact a doctor as quickly as possible? And I'd remembered that our company had signed up for a service that was called Teladoc. and it's a remote medical service. So you can contact Teladoc. They will put you on a video conference with a doctor very, very quickly. And so I put in a request for that, and they said a doctor will call you within 10 minutes, which is just amazing to me. Now, while I was waiting on this doctor and my nose was bleeding, of course I went to the ultimate source of medical advice, which is also Wikipedia, and looked up nosebleeds, and basically it's a very, very long article, and I'll just summarize it for the sake of time. It says that if you have a nosebleed, it's probably okay, but you might be dying. Right? That's a summary of this very, very long article. So, very concerned about that last part. I started to call friends that sort of knew, maybe knew something about these things, and got all kinds of conflicting advice. Lean your head forward, lean your head back. Very, very controversial. But one of them said that it has something to do with your blood pressure, about the kind of imminent death part. So I searched inside the App Store, and I found an app that will check your blood pressure. Right? And it's a very awkward-looking experience. I don't encourage you to do it in public, but you essentially put your finger over the flash in the camera on the back, and you do a couple of things. You hold the microphone up to your heart, and it's supposed to give you an approximation of your blood pressure. Mine was high. Which was probably just stress of trying to learn how to use the app. But what I found so fascinating about this experience, and then thankfully the doctor called for a video chat and said it probably looked okay. But what I found fascinating about this is I never envisaged this use case for the iPhone. But the time that I needed it, there were people that had contributed innovation to that platform in a way that transformed this device, it was usually a phone or a GPS system or something like that for me, into a medical terminal. And I just found that absolutely incredible. And I think that's how we need to think about security purchases. Can those things be adapted to future situations that are at this time unknown? Second property. We need to be agnostic in deployment between on-premise and cloud. This again speaks to how rapidly organizations are changing. We don't know where we are going to have to deploy defenses. And if you think about analytics, the real value of analytics is to help a user make a better decision. To do that, you need to be somewhere in the path between the user and that decision. And there is a concept for this that is well known, very old, just like defense in depth, and it is the physical concept of a proxy. So don't think about a network proxy for a second. Think about the original definition of what a proxy is. It is a person that acts on behalf of someone else. Think about proxies in your real life. Often they're attorneys or doctors. There's someone that acts on your behalf but augments your wishes with a set of expertise. And if we think about security and we think about analytics, we are going to have to be able to insert these analytically equipped proxies into flows at different places. We may not be able to put it in a flow that's in the network because maybe the user's not on the network. We may have to put it at the endpoint. We may have to put it right in front of the cloud service. But we're going to have to think broadly about how we can deploy a place that we can run analytics and assist the user in making better decisions. It's easy in the physical world for people to assess risk. You're in a dangerous neighborhood when there's bullet holes on the windows. But on the internet, it's incredibly difficult to assess risk. Even for security professionals, what is going to happen if I click on this URL? I don't know. So I need something that is going to act on my behalf and has the benefit of analytics on the back end to protect me from a decision that I'm about to make with very limited information. Third one, we have to have competency in failure. We need to embrace the concept of failure. We don't want to fail, but we have to realize that given a determined attacker, that not considering failure scenarios and preparing for failure is failure. That is a guarantee for us to fail. And I want to just share with you, I lived in New York for quite a while I was teaching at Columbia, and you live and die over there by these things. How many people have seen these things before? They are the subway passes that you use to go everywhere. And if you look on the back of them, there's some interesting different sets of information. Some are very informative, some are funny, some are things like, if you see something, say something. One of them that's my favorite is, and it's a little blurry, so I'll read it to you. It's subway emergency instructions. It's what to do on the subway if there is an emergency that happens in the subway. And so number one is notify train crew or police if you see someone in distress or notice unlawful or suspicious behavior. Okay, fair enough. That's a very good thing to do. Number two, do not pull the emergency cord. Now I want you to consider this for a second. You're in a New York subway, which is a very stressful experience in and of itself. An emergency breaks out, which adds to the stress of your subway experience. Are you going to A, say, you know what, I remember that there was some very important advice that was on the back of my subway card that I should read at just this moment because this is an emergency situation and let me see what I should do? Or, option B, are you going to pull a giant cord that says emergency on it? You're going to pull the emergency cord. This is a system that is designed to fail. It is not designed for human beings to operate it. And so we need to consider the fact that there will be failures in what we do because we have systems made up of people who will make mistakes. And the last thing is we need to be able to make reasonable choices in the midst of noisy threat intelligence. And threat intelligence is very, very rarely black or white. It's good or bad. Often there's a lot of stuff in the middle. And I want to just talk to you about one interesting application of this that we've been working on, and we call it Project Dolphin. And I'll skip some of the details, but just kind of give you an overview of what it is. Basically, it's this idea that if I look at the image of a web page that is constantly phished or a target of phishing, like the Gmail login page, for example, right? Constant target for phishers. And I do fuzzy hashing of that page. So I break it up into a grid, do hashes of little pieces of it, and then look for any new URLs that are entering the system and say, are they in some way similar to this login page? And then is the domain, is the website owned by, in this case, Google? Right? And that's a very interesting task to see, is this potentially a phishing site that's trying to steal your credentials? So we call it Project Dolphin just because, I don't know, one of the linguists really likes dolphins. And the way that it works is, on the left is a picture of a dolphin. On the right is also a picture of a dolphin. If you did a hash of each of these pictures, even though visually they look very similar, the hashes, of course, will be completely different. But in this fuzzy hashing approach, these things are quite similar, as visually you would expect them to be. So there's a 91% match between these two images. On the left is a picture of a dolphin. On the right is not a dolphin. Right? But it is a sea-based animal, and it's got water around it, so there are some similarities. And if you apply this fuzzy hashing algorithm, there's a 50% match. Now imagine applying this on scale to the 10 most phished websites and looking at, which is what we look at, about 1.5 billion brand new URLs that have never been seen before every day, and applying this every single time. You can find phishing sites before they're even deployed on scale. To me, this is an example of analytics inserted into the flow. That's something a person could never do, but technology can assist you with. So I'd encourage you to think about these properties, and I'm painfully over time, so I want to leave you with the last concept. Now, so much is changing in cybersecurity. If you went back 10 years ago and look at the textbooks and what they told you to do, and I wrote several of them, so I'm ashamed to say this, it's different now from how things were back then, and the assumptions that we made back then about security and about defense in depth. And the closest thing that I can think of physically that's similar to it is when I learned how to drive. So when I learned how to drive, I was taught and tested on, you've got to hold the steering wheel in the 10-2 position. Right? How many people have ever heard that or had to learn that when they learned how to drive? This was in the manual, this was international, everybody was taught this for a very long period of time. And it wasn't a random thing that somebody came up with. It is the statistically calculated optimal hold of the wheel, so that if something happened, like a cat wandered into the street, you would have the maximum agility so that the cat could survive and you could survive and you could move the wheel without going hand over hand, which is apparently very dangerous. So this is what they teach you to do. Now, of course, after the driver's test, you never ever do this again, and you hold it with like a finger or a coffee cup or something like that, which I don't encourage. Today, when somebody is taught how to drive, they are taught to hold the wheel very differently. They're taught to hold the wheel in the 9-3 position. It turns out that that 10-2 hold that a whole generation of folks were taught is today terrible advice, horrible advice, dangerous advice even. The correct way to hold the wheel today is in the 9-3 position. Why? Something changed in the environment. It's the advent and popularization of airbags. If you hold the wheel in the 10-2 position, you're either going to burn a hand, break an arm, or punch yourself in the face. Right? None of which are very good outcomes of an accident. But if you hold the wheel in the 9-3 position, it is a balance in between agility and the changes that have happened in that environment. It's very hard for somebody that was told something at one time in the past that was fact to unlearn that thing and now learn something different. But that is where we find ourselves in the information security field today. So I'd encourage you as you go through the rest of this event is to think through and challenge some of the rooted assumptions that you may have about security from the past. And that's why I love this event. It is a very, very challenging event in the sense that it can cause us to come together and re-examine some of those preconceived notions, some of those precedents that we've been exposed to in the past, and ask, is this still true and does it still hold? Thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of the conference.